Hey.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to First Wednesday, as always hosted by Paddy O'Connell, Broadcasting House. Before I hand over to Paddy, if I can ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. Over to Paddy.
Millie, thanks very much. Hello, everyone, friends, rivals. We've got something a little bit different to propose to you tonight, which is that this strategic topic we bring to a close at 8:28 because we started 2 minutes late. And then people who want to leave. And then I think I propose doing 10 minutes on Egypt. And, it means prolonging the evening if you want to, but there's a coup underway as we speak. And many of you in the room have specialisms that you can share with us. And perhaps we can look at the news feeds and have a discussion after this discussion. So it's like, my God. So the first thing to say is we've got a great panel, but I've learned a great audience. It's interactive. It's a public meeting. Don't be bored till the end and then complain. So could we have a vote early on? Could you reveal if you are for talking to the Taliban? Could you put your hand up? So it's got the look of less than half to me. And if you're against talking to the Taliban,
that's a lot less than half.
That's about 10%. And if you're undecided, could you put your hand up? That's the other option. Okay, so some of you haven't voted at all, I see, which is fair enough. Why should you? So if I could ask you to introduce yourselves, panel, including your first thought on this important topic. Dawood, you can introduce yourself and withhold your opinion, if you like.
Well, my name is Dawood Azami. I've been working for the BBC World Service for 13 years. I was also based in Kabul for a couple of years in 2010 and 11. And I've been keeping an eye on events in that part of the world.
They're bad. They're bad.
Well, there are some good things too.
Okay. Yeah. Well, we haven't got that long to hear them. But Frank, what about you?
Yeah, I was born and brought up as a barrister and then moved on to the military. I served several tours here and there. And then as a civilian advisor for the UK, served in Helmand as a justice advisor. And I've recently written a couple of books. One's called Losing Small Wars and the other's called Investment in Blood, about the cost of the war in Afghanistan.
Should we talk to the Taliban?
Oh, yeah.
Lucy?
Yes, I worked in Afghanistan both before and after 9/11. I spent about 6 years after 9/11 working there as a journalist, as a researcher for the ICG on justice issues, as political advisor for the European Union. And I then wrote a book which was was based on a peace plan that had existed around the time of 9/11, but which our intelligence agencies chose not to follow. And we've done a paper basically on this. I think it's in the bio at the beginning.
And should we talk to the Taliban?
Yes, but with caveats.
Yeah, because downstairs you said no.
Well, I will explain that.
Okay. And John?
I'm a freelance, well, I was a photojournalist, then I became a filmmaker. I do a bit of writing, and I've worked in Afghanistan since early 2006. I haven't really worked very many other places since then. I've been in Afghanistan an awful lot. I spent time with the British troops in 2006 and 2007, but I spent a lot of time with US troops, with Canadian troops. I've moved around Afghanistan from the south right up to the northeast, in Nuristan and Kunar, and I think I have a different view of Afghanistan than a lot of journalists who've just gone to sort of their host nation, so British in Helmand or Canadians in Kandahar, etc. And yeah, so I spent a lot of time out there. I've spoken to a lot of different people, not just embedded, but working unilaterally as well.
And what's your personal view of the answer to this question, talking to the Taliban?
I think it brings us back to the question, who are the Taliban? I think we have to recognise that it's a disparate group of people. It's not a monolithic organisation. It doesn't have a CEO and a board of directors. I think if we're going to have a meaningful conversation tonight, we have to also talk about people like, or groups like the Haqqani Network and Hekmatyar. And particularly, I have just to say, Bo Bergdahl particularly is going to come up tonight, and too often he's talked about and referred to as a Taliban captive, while actually people know accept that he's held by Haqqani Network.
Okay, right. So let's make sure we do discuss who are the Taliban, who are the officials in Doha, are they out of touch? But let's not do that now. Let's do that in a moment. Let's rehearse the most extreme arguments against talking to the Taliban for a few minutes, and this could involve you in the audience. They've been the enemy. The public in many Western countries have seen people killed by them. Women have been killed by them. They also shielded Osama bin Laden from the West. Now, let's talk about some of the caveats that you have. And we know they're caveats, but could you lay out some chapters about why people don't want to, even if it's not you, Lucy?
Yes. I mean, my major concern about what's happening at the moment in Doha and the events of last week is that this is not so much the beginning of a political process as really an 11th hour political fix. And the reason, I think we have to look more deeply at why that's happening now and what's going on behind the scenes or below the radar, as it were. And I think, you know, one has to take into account several things. I think the major thing is that there is a proxy war between India and Pakistan going on in Afghanistan. I think that the Western nations and the US are desperate to get their troops out and their equipment out, billions of dollars worth of equipment, mostly by next year. I mean, we don't know how many troops the Americans are going to leave behind, but clearly they need to use Pakistan's territory to do that.
So was talking to the Taliban a good idea 10 years ago, but now it's a bad idea?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been before General Carter had said 2002. It had to be at the time of the Bonn process in 2001. But basically, I think Karzai was right to backpedal last week, because the problem is that Pakistan holds all the cards, and they're extracting a very, very high price for this. And I think, you know, we have to sort of be more clear about that's going on in the background.
And Frank, from the point of view of military people, some of whom are in the room, there's been a lot of death. Do they want to talk to the people who fired in the other direction?
Well, I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago who was a company commander in one of the more volatile areas, let's say, which is to say lethally dangerous and savagely bloody, of Helmand. And when he got there, this would be 2 or 3 years ago, in the heat of the fight, as it were, things have calmed down a bit since then, I think, as everyone agrees, at least for the British. He went, as one does, to go to see the local lads in Ashura, the local council, the local leaders, tribal and political elders, if you can call them that, in his area. And the usual discussion was had, why are you here? We're here to protect you from the Taliban, he said. So everybody laughed. The whole room, probably about the same number of people as there are in here, a couple of hundred people, started giggling and laughing. And so, you know, being a diplomatic sort of guy, this army officer, very capable army officer, very brave army officer, I said, well, guys, what's the problem? Why are you laughing? He said, well, we had the Taliban in this morning and they said that they were here to protect us from you. At which point, as a joke, my friend said, well, perhaps we should meet and talk things out. And of course, in the old days, which is to say when we knew what we were doing in conflicts like this, with several decades or even a century of experience, that's exactly how things were done. Negotiations were had, in this case, this sort of local ceasefire, which was never going to happen in this environment. This kind of thing was done commonly by people who really knew what they were about. Now, just to address things more directly, we had one of our current military chiefs, General Carter, last week say this should have been done 10 years ago. Well, I taught at Cranwell, which is the Royal Air Force College, and I used to teach my cadets. In fact, this was all part of the curriculum. I'm sure they teach the same kind of thing at Sandhurst and Dartmouth and Lympstone, that war is a political act. And war devoid of a political track is existential war. It's simply a Hobbesian situation. That's what we've had, certainly in Helmand, over the last 9 or 10 years.
It's been war for its own sake.
War, essentially, yes,
right.
without political objectives.
So, and just in a sentence, sorry for now, are there military people who don't want to talk to the Taliban, do you think?
I'm sure there are.
But you're not...
most of the folk that I speak to consider this as merely a matter of common sense.
Common sense.
Yeah.
To you...
Look at the Irish example.
Right. John, you've told us, you know, to know who we're talking about, but give us the worst option. Who shouldn't we talk to? You know, because at the moment we're rehearsing the don't talk to them arguments.
There's lots of people that you shouldn't talk to. There are lots of people on the battlefield who are so wrapped up in the violence at this stage that they cannot see no clear way out at all. And there are people who are not on the battlefield who are so removed from the battlefield that they are quite keen to sort of move towards peace. But the connect between those who claim to be in command and those who are doing the dirty, nasty fucking fighting and killing, the disconnect is huge, I think. And you know, there are people in Qatar who are saying they can do X, Y, and Z, and I am not convinced that they can at all. And just to follow on from what you were saying about this idea that, you know, it said war is a continuation of politics by other means. I don't have a degree in military strategy. Actually, I don't have a degree in anything. But I think that that's bollocks. I think that if war is the continuation of politics, it's not. War is the failure of politics.
I didn't say it was a continuation. I said it's a political act.
Okay.
That's a misquotation. Clausewitz, John.
Yes, indeed it is. Well, I would say it's the other way around, and the politics is the solution to war, and so you have got to, basically, sooner or later, you're going to talk to these fuckers. So let's make it sooner, and let's ease the pain. That is the reality. And I know lots of people who have faced the bullets, who've been shot at, and I've been shot at, and I've been shot, and it's all very unpleasant. But you're going to have to talk to these people. And if you talk about Northern Ireland, you know, you will fight and fight and fight. And somebody said, you know, it became a common term in the British military, you know, fighting the Taliban is like mowing the grass. And, you know, you can't kill them all, because every time you kill one, you make more. And, you know, Northern Ireland was the same thing. Like, people like to forget that the British Army went into Northern Ireland. I'm going to be very unpopular at home for this. But
and also very off topic.
Well,
so, I mean, okay. So we'll come back to that. So in the room now, who is morally against talking to? Are there any women who don't want their noses sliced off? Are there any gays who don't particularly want to be on the front of time hung upside down? Is there anyone who's a relative of someone who's had their legs blown off? I mean, is there any moral reason in the room? Because the panel is being very intellectual. Would you like to go first here, and then we'll come to you behind? We're rehearsing arguments against talking to the Taliban. What's yours? And do you have a name?
Yeah, my name is Katie, and I don't pretend to be half as clever or as experienced as the people on the panel. And I feel really ignorant to say don't talk, because I think that you have to explore new options, because keep going the same thing that doesn't work is a silly thing. But I do feel that there is a difference between the people in Ireland and the Taliban just feels so nasty to so many people in its own country that it can't necessarily be reasoned to. Now, that might be because that's my interpretation of the law and of the news. But also as well, it does feel at the moment, because we're announcing we're going to withdraw, now we're going to talk, it just feels like it's an admission of failure.
Okay, and as a British citizen, does it feel like loss of uniformed life for nothing if you go and talk to the people who shot them?
Again, I guess I feel slightly priggish to comment on it, just because I recognise that I'm not the one who's putting my life on the line. So. Okay,
and to you, sir, would you like to, and then coming to you next, the woman on Millie, the woman here as well, in front of me, put your hand up again. Let's not go on about this forever. Who's talking? To you with the mic.
No, okay. I just wanted to actually take it back one step, maybe, which is to say, for years now, people have been suggesting talking with the Taliban. David Loyne's talked here about it. He doesn't speak any Pashto himself. Roy Stewart's talked about it. He doesn't speak Pashto. Cooper Coles, I think, recently has said, talk to them. He doesn't speak any Pashto. Also, Danitz, Nick Carter said it last week. He doesn't speak any Pashto. Probably if you said something like Shudni or Nuristani, probably wouldn't even know what those languages were. On the panel, Frank, a good friend of mine, you know I've got no more respect for anyone else in the world, but legal advisor in Helmand, you know, you're good at Serbo-Croat, Polish, don't speak any Pashto. Don't know about the other members of the Taliban, of the panel. Sorry, that was to the tongue. But I suppose the question is that we've been there for 10 years. I've, you know, never met an FCO diplomat who can speak Pashto, let alone Nuristani. I've never met an MI6 person who can speak any of those languages. And I've met a couple of military intelligence officers who studied it at Beaconsfield, but one of them complained because it was so useless, couldn't come out speaking anything, and got kicked. Well, he was told to wind his neck in and left.
Point well made.
So the point is that if if no one in the UK can actually speak any of the languages that the Taliban speak, is talk with the Taliban nothing more than empty words.
Right, and it's a great point. And let me, I didn't mean to be facetious. Let me just ask Dawood, who doesn't want to comment on the should we. Is our friend here drawing attention to the fact if and when it's going to be through other people. We're going to appear as distant as we did when we went in 2001. Is he right to raise a cultural question? Whose language are we talking in?
Well, I mean, it's true. A lot of mistakes were made,
And is language one of the mistakes we'll make again?
I think it is, because if you don't speak the language, you cannot communicate. If you don't communicate, you don't understand the complexities of the situation. So it's a complex situation. There are so many players. There is history, there is ideology, there is nationalism, there are grievances, there is the question of injustice, and there's the power sharing question and the proxies and so many other things. There's the international militancy. So the picture is very complex.
And for the record, do you speak Pashtun?
I speak Pashto and many other languages.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
That's it. And to you next.
My point is quite brief. I just want to point out that, like we said earlier, we don't quite know who the Taliban are.
And we're coming to that.
The problem is, of course, is that if all of the opposition to British rule is not united under the Taliban, by talking to one group or privileging one group over another, you won't eradicate all of the discontent.
Right, it's a long, but why shouldn't we talk to them? Why shouldn't we talk to them?
Because you'll be legitimising one group over another and giving that group a voice.
Coming to the panel again, but it's an audience meeting.
Paddy, I'm going to say something really harsh. I've been following Taliban since '96 when they first took over. Got Pasha's son, actually, who used to go to the Arab League meetings. And I mean, who are the Taliban? The Taliban are the people who are running Afghanistan. I mean, David Kilcullen, who was Petraeus' assistant about 6 years ago in Chatham House, said there were 11 or 18 civic governments. They weren't putting their fingers up girls and cutting people's arms off. They were running civic government. And in fact, the people we're on the side of are sitting in Kabul, and a lot of warlords we have no control over at all. I mean, isn't the Taliban in control? Does it actually make a particle of difference whether we talk to them or not?
Would you like to respond, all of you, to what we've heard? Would you like to go first on, including this last point?
Well, actually, I just wanted to come back to something else. When you cut me off from my saying I was too long, no, I'm not going back to that, but I want to make the point you're saying, why shouldn't we talk to them? One of the reasons that we shouldn't talk to them, I spoke to several friends in Afghanistan.
Can you hear John, by the way? Is he amplified?
You hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, over the last few days I spoke to several friends out there to get their views, to get the Afghan views on what they say. And one of my friends in particular said there's absolutely no way that any talks should be taking place with the Taliban representatives in Qatar, because all they're trying to do is take advantage of the Americans' desperation to get Bo Bergdahl back, and I'm going to come back to this guy again, the only US prisoner in Afghanistan. They desperately want him out because when they pulled out of Vietnam, they left lots of guys behind, and every US base you go to, you see the black flag, the POW MIA, and it's kept Vietnam in the memory to this day. And the Americans do not want that to happen again, and they will do pretty much anything to get him out. And so the guys in Qatar know that, and my friend says that the whole of the negotiation that's going on is about leveraging that and getting as many Taliban guys out of Guantanamo as possible.
So wrong language, wrong time, wrong motivation as reasons why we might not talk to the Taliban. And I know you've got a lot more to say. Would you like to pick up the rest of the panel on this? There's a theme developing on why we might not talk to them.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think the Americans are very desperate, and it's not just Bo Bergdahl. It's getting their equipment out. And I just want to reiterate, Pakistan holds the cards here. There is Afghan Taliban and there are Pakistani Taliban, but essentially they are given strategic support and sanctuary from Pakistan. And there is an Afghan think tank, for example, in California, the New World Strategies Coalition. You can read their stuff on their website. And they basically say, the Taliban is a movement that was created on whiteboards in Rawalpindi. It's created and run from Rawalpindi in Pakistan. And, having read a lot of the literature on the peace talks in the 1980s and the sabotaging of those talks after the Geneva Accords when the Russians left, and the sabotaging of different peace agreements and when Pashtuns tried to work together against the Soviets, the support of proxy warlords like Hekmatyar, who was rocketing the citizens of Kabul when he was prime minister, who's he supported by? Pakistan.
Okay.
And who is Mullah Omar? I mean, we can come back to this.
We will. And in terms of moving us along, shall we turn to the arguments for? Because I think we have to keep an eye on the clock. Frank, would you like? You were very strident in your earlier remark. Would you like to move us now to the discussion of for? And we'll take audience questions on this as well. What are the reasons for talking to these murderous, dubious people?
Hey, let's take. I know you don't want to talk about Ireland, but at least two of us on the panel are Irish. Maybe you are as well. But you know, you mentioned you mentioned the IRA and how they seem in retrospect to have a certain green glow about them. They were a nasty bunch too, and I think whether or not they're nasty murderers is neither here nor there. They, whoever they are, and Lucy's already made, John Deere made that point extremely eloquently already. Whoever they are the opposition. Now, whether they're the Asli, as the Helmandis call them, Asli Taliban, which is the real Taliban, the guys who are in Quetta, and I think the same team as are in Qatar, or whether they are the local boys who were talking to my friend, the company commander, who lost, by the way, 14 out of 28 of his platoon killed or injured because they didn't talk at the time. Whoever they are, the time has come to stop fighting for the sake of fighting, because whether we put it, however we put it, and that's a very simplistic way of putting it, what we have had is existential war. No one has offered an alternative. What is the alternative to talking to the opposition? One might even go wider than talking to the so-called Taliban, whoever they are, because talking to the Taliban, be they Quetta or Hekmatyar or the Haqqani network, will be of no use whatsoever unless we take up Lucy's point, which is making sure that all the other stakeholders in the region, this is Cooper Coles makes this point all the time, unless they're brought in, there will be no future to these discussions.
You're saying talk to the Taliban and?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, and.
And do you want to come in at this point? I know you said, yes?
I want to make, well, there was a question about different groups in Afghanistan who are fighting.
We can bring that in now, we can bring that in.
So, yeah, I think as far as I know, the Taliban, there are two insurgents groups in Afghanistan, one led by Hekmatyar, which is called Hizb Islami, and the other is led by Mullah Omar, called the Taliban.
That's two in Afghanistan?
Two in Afghanistan. And Haqqani network is part of Mullah Omar's Taliban group. They've said that many times that we accept Mullah Omar, and Haqqani, the senior Haqqani, was a minister in Mullah Omar's government in Afghanistan in the 90s. And they've said this openly, that we accept Mullah Omar as our leader. Operationally, they have some independence. They operate independently of the mainstream Taliban movement. But organizationally, they are one group. And you are right, John. The American soldier is with the Haqqani network because he was arrested by the Haqqanis. But when it comes to prisoner exchange, they have one policy. They want 5 prisoners from Guantanamo as a prisoner exchange for that American soldier. So 1 point. So it's one Taliban. And the guys who are in Qatar are representing Mullah Omar because many of them were part of the Taliban government in the 90s. One of them was their ambassador in Saudi Arabia. The other one was their ambassador in UAE.
Okay.
The head of the office in Kandahar was chief of staff of Mullah Omar.
And there's more, we'll do more on this. So you're telling us, you know, there's a reason why. From the audience now, reasons to talk to them. And we'll come back to the panel to talk about who they are. But we're doing reasons to talk to them. Do introduce yourself again.
My name is Luke. Just so we try and avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, what on earth did the Russians do when they left?
So, did they just leave as a matter of fact, or did they talk to anyone when they left is a question? Do we know?
They left the Afghan Socialist Republic behind.
But did they speak to anyone, or did they just pull out quickly?
No, the Russians didn't talk to the Mujahideen groups. They were talking to Americans and Pakistanis. They were meeting in Geneva. That's why we have the famous Geneva Accord. So they were not meeting the Taliban, the Mujahideen leaders directly. So it was mainly talks between Afghan government at that time, the Soviet Union, and Americans, and the Pakistani government.
Okay,
there were 4 parties.
So the answer to your question is they went the international route. To you, John D., why should we talk to the right people? I asked you, why should we not talk to the wrong people? Why should we talk to the right people?
Because there are people who are tired of fighting. There are people who have also seen that they're not making any progress. I interviewed an ex-Taliban fighter about 1.5 years ago who had spent 6 years fighting in the Taliban in Nuristan and Kunar, and after 6, and I said, and he had just reconciled with the government and was working with the police, and I asked him, well, after 6 years, you know, why did you decide to change sides? And he said, because I realized I was on the wrong side. I said, well, how did you become a Taliban? And he was like, well, you know, you grow up in my village, And when you get to a certain age, you pick up a rifle and you go in the mountains and you fight with the local guys. Which, you know, I would say in Northern Ireland, lots of guys who went out and threw stones and petrol bombs were not, you know, massively motivated, but actually were trying to prove themselves, maybe impress a girl. You know, this thing, you know, it is, you know, across the world, you look at it, and lots of people who get involved in these things are not, they're not the absolute, radical's the wrong word, but they're not the extreme hard line. And if you can talk to the people who are not that extreme, you know, I spoke to another friend in Afghanistan yesterday who said that he believes that the, lots of people, he said, believe that the Karzai government or the administration supported the Taliban office being created in Qatar because it would create division within the Taliban.
So why do people from the Taliban want to talk now? I was asking why do we think we might want to, but no, Lucy first. Why do the other side, why do they want to talk? And within the other side there are different groups, but what's the push factor?
I think you've got to see this on different levels. I mean, it's very, very complicated. On the one hand, you have, as you say, you have moderate Taliban who want to reconcile because they're tired, they're fed up, and so on. On the other hand, though, I think there is a civil war that is still there in the background, that was there on the 10th of September 2001 between the Afghan Taliban and the Northern Alliance. And that, that hasn't gone away. So there are people in the government who don't necessarily want some of those moderates to reconcile. I think one of the major mistakes that we made, as well as failing to recognize Pakistan's desire for strategic depth against India and to hold Afghanistan as a legitimate sphere of influence. But the second major mistake that we made was to fail to help the Afghans to deal with the past. So what I'm talking here is transitional justice and a process of accountability. And that is the only way you can bring reconciliation in Afghan society. That there have been many different caseloads of extreme violence and atrocities over the last 40 years.
Does that explain why Taliban people want to talk?
I know, but there are different... The reason why they can't, they're being obstructed from doing so because there are other power holders who needed to be removed and could have been removed had we had a process of accountability and made people accountable for those war crimes that some of them carried out.
If we could break down just from Frank, can you tell us why do people from the Taliban side or sides want to talk? You've explained you think it's an existential war. Do they see it the same way? Are they fed up with being killed?
They have two political objectives. You can check out on their website what their objectives are. And one is the removal of foreign forces, very simple, and the other is the installation of Sharia law. Foreign forces are going, Sharia law is already halfway there. And they see that their political objectives, insofar as they exist, as seriously achievable. And I imagine they look at things as every other fighter does. You are fighting for something, which is something that can't be said necessarily for the British effort over the last 10 years.
Can I come on this point? Why do they want to talk? I think there are four things have motivated the Taliban to talk. One, they couldn't travel for the past 10 years. They were stuck in their caves or couldn't travel freely. And this was an opportunity for them to come out of the cold and show themselves to the rest of the world that we are not just fighters, we are also politicians. We also know diplomacy. So this was one factor. The second was they want their prisoners from Guantanamo because some of them are very high-ranking Talibans who are in Guantanamo. One of them is their army chief. A couple of them are governors. So they wanted their release. The third motivation is possible fundraising, because if they have an office, other people or governments can easily contact them. But when they were in Pakistan or in other places, nobody could reach them. So when they have an address, so people know where they are. In the past, they didn't have an address. And the fourth reason is to use that office in Qatar. I mean, there was an idea that it should have been Saudi Arabia or Turkey or UAE, but eventually it became Qatar is their venue for their political office. So they wanted to use, or they want to use that office to travel to other countries. They have gone to Germany, France, Japan, and recently to Iran from Qatar.
So-
So they want to use that as a base.
Right.
And from Pakistan or from other places, they
And this is
they
everything
couldn't
Karzai wanted
easily
to
travel.
avoid.
So let's just come back to the room here. So you're presenting as quite a lot of upside to the Taliban and quite a lot of must talk from the Western Allies' point of view. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying? Can we hear from the room? Yes, sir, to you. And we'll come back to all of you in turn. But the panelists seem to be saying there's lots of gain for the Taliban's, plural, and we're a must-do, last-minute, wrong language bunch. I don't know what you're going to tell us.
Well, actually, I mean, I'm very much in accord with the panel, and I was wondering if perhaps the problem here is maybe philosophical between the West and the Taliban, in that we say, okay, we're going to fight and fight and fight and fight, and then we stop and then we talk. However, I believe, and this also happened in Iraq where I served with Frank, that there is a much more fluid situation in other areas, and people are quite willing to pursue a strategy of talking and at the same time to apply military pressure and to very subtly, in fact very skillfully, weave those two things together, such as the point that was made about the young American soldier being held kidnapped, and
So-
actually using the violence in order to further the talks.
And who's doing that?
I believe the Taliban, I believe both sides would maybe like to do that. I think the Taliban are more skilled operators at doing this, because quite frankly, they've had more practice.
So lose the war and lose the peace.
I wouldn't quite summarize what I said that way, but okay.
Well, it's not a position of strength,
Yeah.
is it,
No.
for your comrade, your former comrades?
Absolutely not. And I mean, that's one of the big issues, is that I mean, Frank's talking about an old-fashioned approach to it, of people who knew what they were doing. I remember one time when we were in Iraq, we turned up in one place and guys were trying to strong-arm people into giving them concessions on the oil pipe. And we said, look, guys, bugger off with all the weaponry, because they had about 100 tribesmen behind them, and then we can talk. And until we showed up with a battalion and proved that we had the power to do that, they wouldn't talk. And I think it's that combination of things, the fact that violence is actually a continuation of politics in Afghanistan. It's how politics has been fought in Afghanistan for the last 30 years at least. That's why the Taliban are exploiting this situation better than we are.
And to other people in the room who want to comment on how the discussion's going now, yes, you with the tie here, and then you at the back with, unfortunately, with no tie, I noticed, but there we'll still take yours.
I noticed in the four justifications offered by Dawood, not one of them referenced a better Afghanistan from an Afghani's perspective. Will talking with the Taliban effectively lead to a politically stable, more prosperous, better Afghanistan? And I wonder whether anyone on the panel legitimately believes that will be the case.
And would you like to say?
Well, we don't know. I mean, in the beginning of every every political process, there is a sense of conspiracy. So Taliban say that this is a conspiracy to divide us. The Afghan government says that Taliban are establishing a government in exile or an alternative embassy in Qatar. Americans have their own conspiracies. So this is natural. I mean, in the beginning of every political process, it happens. We don't know whether it will work or not, because in the 90s, when the Mujahideen groups were fighting each other, there were several rounds of negotiations and many successful political processes, which seemed successful at the beginning, but the settlement fall apart.
Right, but is it more likely to be better for them? Is talking more likely to be better for people of Afghanistan?
Well, the Afghan government...
War's not great, is it? So is it more likely to be better?
I think everybody in Afghanistan wants to talk to the insurgents. So the problem is on what conditions and what is the desired outcome of that political process. So for Taliban, the desired outcome of this political process is different from what President Karzai thinks.
It's a qualified yes.
Yes. What really has worried a lot of Afghans is the timing of the negotiations.
Are you Afghani?
I'm Afghan myself, yeah. And it's the timing that they are worried about. The Americans are leaving by the end of next year. The international troops are leaving by the next year. Most of them believe that this is only a kind of negotiation to hand over everything to the Taliban and leave here. Yep. So this has made them really worried. Their question is, what is the percentage of success in this discussion? the Taliban have been called to talk for the last 6-7 years, and they haven't been ready to do that. Their perceived patrons, the Pakistani government and ISI, they haven't been ready to go to talks. And they have suffered a lot of pressures during 2009, 2010, 2011, and they did not give up. How could they do it now that they feel that this is the time for reaping? You know, the Americans are leaving, the international troops are leaving, so we are not going to give in anything. We could now start to become more political, as Dawood mentioned. It's time for us to show that now we've got this office, we are political, and now we can take over. And so why should they talk? I mean, if you are a Taliban, why should you do that?
Would you answer the gentleman's question who had the tie about whether or not it's going to be better for the people of Afghanistan to have talks?
I mean, you couldn't find anybody who's against talks, you know.
You couldn't find anybody who's against it?
Yeah, a transparent, you know, a talk that is really, you know, transparent. I mean, people in Afghanistan, a lot of them are believing that this is now a conspiracy against. Again, the Americans are leaving, we are going to be left alone, nobody knows what happens. We are going to be handed over to Pakistani government, and that's what they are saying.
What do you think?
Myself?
Yeah.
I don't think it's really the right time. We need more transparency about it.
Okay, let's go around the panel.
Can I add
Not
one
now,
more
no,
point?
I'll come back to you. We're going to go around the panel. So we're hearing, you know, lots of different strands you can pick up, and then we'll move on a bit.
Okay, so again, I've been talking to a lot of people in the last few days when I knew I was doing this. I was in Panjwai down in Kandahar in April and May of this year making a film for Al Jazeera, and it's very violent, very nasty. But what was interesting was that Panjwai was always a Taliban stronghold, you know, Zangabad and Pai Maluk and Spirwan. And even there, a lot of the people I spoke to are absolutely fed up with the situation. The current situation. People cannot live their lives. They can't go out and harvest their crops. There are IEDs everywhere. You know, you stick your head out of a door and you get shot at. You walk down a path or over a bridge and good chance that there's an IED there. It's just unbearable. And the local people in this Taliban stronghold really are fed up. And I saw a little old man stick his head out of a door and talk to the Afghan local police and the Americans and say, there are IEDs in that bridge, they're set up for an ambush, and then he closed the fucking door and went back in. And I've never seen that before in the south. So people are so I disagree that absolutely everybody wants to talk to the Taliban, but a lot of people do, and a lot of people would say it can't really get any worse. But I spoke to a friend down there, and he said the lack of transparency is the biggest fear. He said, we don't know what's been talked about. And in the south, there's a concern because, you know, this old thing that, you know, not every Pashtun is a Taliban, but, you know, every Taliban, or pretty much every Taliban is a Pashtun. There's a fear that concessions are going to be made, and the south particularly is likely to be handed off to the Taliban, let them have their area of influence. And there are people down there who say, no, we don't even want this. You know, there's been no ceasefire, no discussion of ceasefire. They won't accept the constitution. You know, people down there are very scared.
Lucy, you're nodding. Would you like to speak your nod?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, talk's a great idea, but the problem is that they're likely to happen behind closed doors, run by foreigners. I believe they should be run by Afghans. I don't believe that foreigners should be orchestrating this. When I was in Kabul in June and also in January, and in January people said to me, why are the British supporting the ISI? You know, what is it with the British MI6 and the ISI? Why are you selling us down the river? Their feeling is that we're going to make a deal, that the British are making a deal with Pakistan to basically, you know, hand Pakistan what it wants, and that, you know, they're going to be left high and dry. I think that, I mean, I just want to refer you to this paper that I wrote with two co-authors, which is called A Better Path to Peace, and it's evidence that we submitted to the Defence Select Committee, talking about, you know, what our concerns are about the talks and how they are run. And because ultimately, you know, if we don't do this properly, we're going to end up with a very insecure and unstable Afghanistan. We're going to be back to square one where we were just before 9/11. I was working there at that time. Pakistan was running the show. You used to have Pakistani military and ISI people checking us in and out and flying on 8 flights to go and manage the Taliban in the outlying areas like Herat and so on. I witnessed that. So, you know, I just refer you to that paper, please, if you are, you know, interested in why this could be rather dangerous.
And we'll come back to hear more of your analysis as we go on throughout the evening, because, you know, if you're talking to the parliamentarians, you're influencing them as well as us. And Frank, do the people in Doha have command over the people in Afghanistan? If we're going to have talks, it appears to be focused on the office in Doha. Do those people have any clout, or do they have enough clout?
Well, the Asli Taliban, which I mentioned before, the so-called real Taliban, whom I speak now only really to Helmand, who are the Taliban that bear organisation resemblance to a military force. In other words, they have chains of command, they have rank structures. They're the people that the special forces have been striking to no particular effect over the last couple of years. So it may well be that they do have effect. Most of the people, of course, fighting the British in Helmand have been ordinary farmers and resistance fighters, the people who we called in the old days mujahideen. But let's just remember that the fighting that's going on now is extremely intense. You won't hear it from the BBC. You'd have to go to the American Army newspaper to find out, the Stars and Stripes, to find out that last month alone, 300 ANP, Afghan National Police, were killed, 700 or 800 injured. Nobody knows how many ANA, National Army, were killed, 700 or 800 so-called Taliban killed, and 200 at least civilians killed in June alone. Now that reflects an intensity of fighting that goes way back into the 1980s. It's extremely intense, way, or from our perspective, into 2007-8. It's just we're not involved. And people have had enough, as John D said. I spoke to a couple of Helmandis quite recently. They were complaining particularly about the lack of legacy the British had left. But one of those legacies is the savage fighting that's even now going on in Helmand.
And my question is, and we'll come to you. Yes, Neil, your question's more interesting because you've paid, and we'll come to you next. But I've got a structure in mind for where we go, but I think we're currently on, do the people in Doha represent the people on the ground? If you're going to take us a long way from that, I may not be as friendly as I have been, because just...
Why won't we hear it from the BBC?
I think it's because it doesn't involve British soldiers. Is that right? Is it bias, or is it British soldier deaths?
Oh, the BBC has huge questions to answer over this. I mean, the only real accounts you're going to get for the kind of fighting and the kind of events that are going on are the kind of things you see from John D. And there's one other British person I can think of, and that's Ben Anderson. If you want to know what people are thinking, what our soldiers, or at least American soldiers, are thinking, because our soldiers aren't allowed to speak to journalists, okay, they have a line to take, then you need to go to the work of John D., Ben Anderson, and you can find it on either Al Jazeera or on Vice.com.
But Ben Anderson made a documentary for the BBC.
He made a 30-minute documentary, and he made another one back, I think, in 2007. And that's the only time on the BBC I have seen anything resembling ground truth.
And actually, the one he made in Mashtark, he made himself because the BBC wouldn't commission, had to beg him, please.
We cover it on a daily basis. Can I come on the Qatar?
Well, not quite yet.
Qatar
No. I think so. There's a sort of question of criticism of the BBC.
Yeah,
so
at least.
So more than that. And so Dawood works for the BBC.
Yeah, I think we cover it. We have reporters on the ground, and we cover it pretty much every.
Can you tell everybody about the green book that the reporters have to sign before they go near the British Army?
Well, I haven't worked with the British Army. I go myself. I talk to fighters, villagers, Afghan officials.
The British Army.
The British Army.
The Green Book. Every reporter before
well, let him answer. You asked him.
No,
Maybe
I haven't done embed. I haven't done embed.
All right, okay.
I just go by myself.
Right.
Well, I mean, I think from a position as chair, it's important you air your criticism. You've offered some defence, and there is a team, Ian Pannell and his cameraman, have won an award in America last week. And there are BBC people who have been singled out for praise, but you've heard criticism from the panel. And because I'm working for them once a week, it's been aired. But I'm just going to move on. But I mean, I hope that's fair. No, I don't want to move on quickly. It's been fierce criticism has been aired, but I feel that let's just try and talk about the talks to the Taliban. But we've got that, we've heard that aired. So to you at the back, and the question is: do the people in Doha represent the people on the ground?
Is it me or him?
Well, why don't you go first? Thank you for speaking.
Well, I'm petite, so I need to stand here. Well, the first question about the comments that you made about the BBC, I work for the BBC Persian, and I have covered all those casualties that Afghan national security forces have been having, and we had quite the news about it all the time. In terms of whether Taliban are representing, all those members of the Taliban in Doha are representing Afghans, we are ignoring the fact that Afghan is a multiple ethnic, it's a diverse country, and we have Pashtuns, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and Afghanistan is not only Pashtuns. So Taliban are only perhaps not entirely even Pashtuns. Pashtuns are, as was said a while ago, that not all Pashtuns are Taliban, but Talibans are entirely Pashtun. But they are representing a small segment of that Pashtun ethnic minority. But the rest of the country is entirely opposed to Taliban and Taliban's ideologies.
Okay, would you pass the microphone behind? And the question is, in Doha, how representative are the people we'd end up talking to?
Well, I work also for the BBC, but I got back here a week ago.
The BBC.
I got back, I was in Afghanistan a week ago, and, you know, as my friend Zia said, that people are so much concerned about 2014, what they call it doomsday. You know, when I arrived there, everyone was asking me, you come from London, do you know what happens in 2014? So that's when, you know, all the troops withdraw from Afghanistan. But my question is that, you know, I'm not really against the nature of talks, but as, you know, guys raised earlier, there should be transparency because, you know, at the same time talks are going on, but on the other hand, people are getting butchered in Afghanistan. But now my question actually from the panel is that, you know, I know that you know the American troops and the British troops, they hurried to leave Afghanistan in 2014. But what happens actually to the achievements, especially in freedom of expression, women's rights? You know, are they really worried about that, or you know what matters to them is just, you know, these negotiations, because the objectives of the Taliban never you know, change.
Right, hold that thought. Do you speak Pashtun? I'm just interested to
a bit, yes.
A bit, okay. Yeah. So what's at stake in the talks for women and so on, I'm going to come to in just a second. It's everyone who's come to the room feel they know a satisfactory answer to this question. Did the people in Doha have control over the people on the ground? It's one of the things we wanted to cover in this meeting, and I only wanted to move on if you feel you've got that answered. There's a bunch of people in Doha with a flag. Do they have any control over the people on the ground? Have the panel told us the answer to that question? No. So could you tell us? Yeah. Do the people in Doha, yes or no, have competent command structures on the people on the ground? And then we're going to move on.
Well, it's the other way around. I was in Doha last week. People on the ground have control on the people in Doha because they represent people on the ground. They don't control the fighters, the commanders. The commanders have more power than those who are present in Doha office, and they report to them regularly. So this is the reality.
I believe I did say earlier that there is a disconnect between the people who are in Qatar in the talks and the fighters who are on the field. I interviewed Abdul Hakim Mujahid last year, who was the Taliban, not ambassador, envoy to the UN, who's now reconciled with the government and is part of the is deputy leader of the Afghan Peace Council. And he talked about the armed opposition approaching the talks with peace in their hearts. And I said, well, hang on, they've just cut off 17 people's heads in Helmand. And Amrullah Saleh, who I'd interviewed a few days before, who was the head of the NDS, was particularly bitter about this and saying, why are the Americans pushing for talks when they're cutting off heads? If they were American heads, would the Americans push for talks? And I asked Mujahid about this, and I had my Paxman moment. 5 times he dodged the bloody question and wouldn't. But the fact is, it's clear they don't have control. So I'm going to come to Frank and Lucy now. Thank you. I think we've now been told that, you know, fascinating moments the other way round. You raised the question, what's at stake? Let's move on to that now. If there are talks with the wrong people at the wrong time in the wrong language, what's at stake for the people of Afghanistan for, let's just take women's rights. Frank, you're in favour of talking. Yeah. What's going to happen to women after the talks?
I'm not sure that this shibboleth about Taliban and women's rights is entirely right. Let's remember that the most famous case is Aisha Bibi, who I think was the front page of Time or Newsweek a couple of years ago. She was disfigured, you remember? Ears and nose cut off, horribly disfigured. The Taliban were not involved in that, right? That was a judgment executed by a Pashtun court under very commonly accepted, whether we like it or not, strictures of the Pashtun Valley, okay? As somebody said at the time, the headline in Newsweek was, this is what happens if the Taliban take over. Yeah. No, it's what's happening now. Why? Because that, and whether we like it or not, that kind of treatment of women is endemic, whoever's in charge in the south. And we see now Karzai making deals with the Shias and various other interest groups in Afghanistan for political gain, compromising hard-won rights of women. the Taliban have learnt a few lessons, as I understand it, over the last, from people I talked to, over the last half decade or so. And one of those lessons is they alienated an awful lot of people. Whether they will alienate more by accepting Western strictures on women's rights is a matter that only they can answer. One thing, though, concerning whether or not the guys in Doha have any influence over the people on the ground, one group that's only had one mention so far that absolutely know the answer to that is the ISI of Pakistan.
Right. Now, let's try and keep ourselves to the question of what's at stake in the talks. It came from the floor from an Afghan reporter identifying himself as working for the BBC. Lucy, would you like to tell us what's at stake for human rights in talking to the Taliban? You know, if they want Sharia law, do you?
No, I mean, I lived in Pakistan, in Afghanistan during the Taliban period, and I lived in Kandahar, in fact. And it was relatively secure. I think one of the major mistakes that we've made is that we're failing also to understand that you need to deal with a more legitimate local leadership rather than just strongmen. And one of the criticisms that was made when I was in Afghanistan in June, one of my Afghan friends actually said to me, you know, the West has succeeded in the last 12 years to destroy something that the communists and the Taliban didn't manage to destroy, and that's the tribal system. Because we're only dealing with these strong guys. Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was what's at stake, and could I ask you to consider what's at stake for human rights in talking to them? Do we have to sell it down the river?
Yeah, I mean the human rights thing is much more complicated because, as the gentleman here pointed out, you do have kind of Taliban-style guys in the present government who come from the Northern Alliance. I think that the real weakness that we have in approaching these talks is that we think that there's this hawk-dove divide within the Taliban and that we can engage with the doves. But what's really going to happen is ultimately we're going to end up engaging with the jihadist element of the Taliban, the hawks, and they're going to be the ones who end up ultimately in control because of the very clever orchestration of what's going on behind the scenes by the ISI, and that's going to spill over into Pakistan, and that's going to be a genie out of the bottle that even the Pakistanis
and
can't
to
control.
everyone, again, on what's at stake, we could make it a condition of talks that everyone respects the current constitution, and the current constitution does enshrine some rights, albeit disputed, and again, we'll come to your views in the room, but, you know, would that be a condition, John D., that worked?
But those rights are being already undermined without Taliban present in Parliament, and I agree. There are things that happen in Afghanistan that we don't like, but they're happening anyway, and the Taliban are not in charge and they're not responsible for all of them. You could put that condition in place, but, you know, I would say a lot more sensible to put a condition of a ceasefire in place, because there'd be a lot more people alive today than there were a few weeks ago. And there are all sorts of conditions, and I don't understand why these conditions haven't been put in place.
So just to, I don't know if you've still got the microphone, but if we don't know what's at stake from talks, would ceasefire's condition of talks be something so big that it would be worth having even if you didn't know all the answers to these other questions?
Well, I think at least people, you know, what they want is an environment that when they want to go out, at least they should believe that they come back. Because when I was there, when I arrived in Kabul, actually, there was that attack on the Supreme Court. And my friend was saying that, okay, we, survived today, but we never know that, you know, if something may happen tomorrow. So what people really want at this moment is, you know, a peaceful situation. So ceasefire, I mean, that could be, you know, one of the greatest options. What people really want is they can, you know, go outside, work, and then come back at least peacefully.
I mean, sorry, I think a ceasefire is a joke. We have fueled so many militias in Afghanistan over the last 12 years because we've not just been able to support the Afghan National Army, we've supported all these illegal armed groups. There's no way that the West is going to be able to maintain a ceasefire. What do we have to negotiate with? I mean, we're leaving. And, frankly also, I mean, the other thing that I wanted to say is that there has been a very, very ruthless strategy to control humanitarian space in the last couple of months, or last month or so in Afghanistan. And it's been a very specific strategy. The ICRC has now withdrawn 80 staff in the last few weeks. And IOM have done the same. And they've had very specific and targeted threats. And, I think that when the ICRC leaves, I think, you really have to start asking questions like, where is this coming from, these threats and these very, very professionally organized attacks?
And has everyone in the room spoken enough about women's rights? Frank said that he felt women's rights are in a bad place no matter who's in charge? And does anyone else who hasn't spoken yet want to come in on that before we start moving along? If we do have talks, what's at stake for women in Afghanistan? Yes, to you. Would you like to comment on that question?
Yes, I would like to comment, because I think Afghan women have suffered so much and still are suffering. And if we're talking to Taliban, that is going, even if it's the moderate side of Taliban, if there is such a thing, I think that they will still, if they have any kind of power, that women would be the first to suffer. Women's education and women's rights are going to suffer, and I really do believe that they will influence that.
So do we go as far as to say, in an uncertain world, it's getting worse for women in Afghanistan no matter what happens?
It's not getting worse. It's at the moment, obviously through government and everything that's going on, there are more school girls in schools and stuff. There more education is happening, so it's improving. But I think if there was more control with Taliban, they would actually. But
the Taliban don't like putting girls in school above the
age
of 6.
Exactly. So
I mean, if
we
have
will be
talks
going
with the
back.
Taliban, can you answer my question? Is it going to get better or worse?
It'll get worse, in my opinion.
Does anyone on the panel disagree with that?
Just a quick point on historical context, by the way, which some people may find interesting. At the end of the Soviet period, in the main cities, 50% of teachers, 40% of government workers, and I think 60% of doctors were women. Okay, that was in 1989. And look at the place we're at now, after 10 years of Western intervention centred supposedly around women's and human rights.
But I mean, and to all of us in the room, we'll move on from women if you want. But do you agree with this view that it's going to get worse for women if we talk to the Taliban? Because the panel are telling us we are going to talk to the Taliban. And no, you've just had it. I'm sorry. Does anyone else want to come in on this question? Panel, John.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think to sound like a real whatever. Perception can be reality often, and I interviewed a 14-year-old skateboarding girl last year in Kabul, a really inspirational character, and she believes that her life, she's too young to remember the Taliban rule, but she believes that her life will be completely changed if the Taliban come back, and therefore she's already in her mind decided that if it looks like they will come back in any way involved jointly in power, that she will have to leave Afghanistan. And I think there are an awful lot of young women in Afghanistan who have that mindset. Whether or not it's right, they believe things will become much worse, and they're very scared about the Taliban coming back.
And to anyone else in the room on this? And to you then, Dawood, do you think that the question is settled, that the society we can't put preconditions on Taliban talks with the Taliban about society? We may want to say, respect the constitution, but we can't do much more. What do you think? What would you say is the current view on that?
Well, initially the U.S. and Afghan government's position was that they should do 3 things before they start negotiations with the Taliban: separate from Al-Qaeda, accept the Afghan constitution, and lay down their arms. So these were the 3 main conditions. But then these 3 conditions became the desired outcomes of the negotiations. So we don't enter a dialogue with the Taliban with these conditions. We will enter into dialogue with the Taliban to get those conditions, or to get these 3 things. And that's why you signed the Taliban statement when they opened the office in Doha. They said that we will not pose any threat to any country. So that was in response to the US when it said that if you are close with Al-Qaeda, if you have links with Al-Qaeda, we wouldn't talk to you. And the second point about the conditions, Taliban say that our main condition is the full withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan. And they say that we can talk to other Afghan groups, we can talk to Afghan government, we can discuss the constitution. And once I asked them that, what is un-Islamic in the Afghan constitution? Have you pointed out some of the articles which are un-Islamic? And they said that no, we can discuss it later. So there is nothing un-Islamic in the current Afghan constitution. when it comes to constitution. So I think it will be easier for them to accept the constitution. So the main problem for the Taliban for the time being is the presence of foreign troops.
Okay, now this is, in a moment we'll move on to how the talks could be conducted, and we're coming to three questions from people who haven't spoken, then we'll move on, but we'll do audience participation now. To you.
I guess I'm just curious about what talks could actually realistically achieve, because Lucy spoke earlier about the option of a ceasefire being unrealistic. And I guess I don't really understand what talks could achieve apart from being a marked alternative to the way we're currently interacting with the Taliban.
Frank?
Well, the way we're currently interacting with the Taliban is killing their leaders with the SAS. So anything is an improvement on that. That's all I've got to say about that.
To you?
Seems like there's consensus everywhere that we're going to leave Afghanistan one way or another. So my question is, talking could either be neutral, good, or bad. Can the panel talk about in what ways talking could make things worse?
That's very much in keeping with what's at stake. So the question specifically is, how would talking make things worse? We've heard, I think, from the lady behind, it's not going to look good for women talking to them. Would you like to add or disagree with my summary? How would talking make things worse, John D?
I think it goes back to undermining ordinary Afghans' confidence in the future.
If it's conducted in a kind of smoky room with a bunch of old foreigners.
Nobody knows what's going
on. That could make it worse.
Yes, absolutely.
Worse than just leaving?
Well,
because we're going to leave anyway.
Let him answer.
Yeah, no, you're leaving anyway. No, the fear at the moment is, the Afghans say we don't know what's going to happen, but it depends. It depends, because in the south, if you talk to people in Kandahar and Helmand, they're absolutely convinced the Taliban are going to come back in and take control without a doubt. In the east, it's more complicated. But the way things are at the moment, if you withdraw, everybody's afraid of what's going to happen, but they expect it to be actually most people expect civil war rather than the Taliban to take over. But if you get into these negotiations and there's smoke and mirrors and whatever, then people are afraid that it's going to, certain areas in the south are going to be handed off, the Taliban are going to be given maybe control of the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. They don't know what's going to happen, but the Taliban coming back into power is pretty much the worst result for an awful lot of people in Afghanistan.
Lucy, the question, how do talks make things worse? If you could try and just limit your answer to that question.
I mean, I think that we might end up having what we think is a negotiated settlement, but where it's basically ISI who are selecting the people that they want us to negotiate with, and that they are essentially doing the horse trading, and because we're too ignorant and we're trying to get involved, that they end up having, the ISI have recognition of those they want recognized, collusion by the West in achieving this so that we cannot back out of that, and the morphing from a pariah jihadist organization into a UN-recognized government. But then, this is going to be perceived in Afghanistan, this is from this paper that we submitted to the Defense Committee, this will be perceived in Afghanistan as a huge strategic victory for jihadists, and that will have repercussions regionally and elsewhere.
Frank, in answering the gentleman, could you perhaps sketch out, you mentioned it's existential war, could you mention how bad it is, and then perhaps go on to answer this question? Because you give us a paragraph on this, how bad, and could it be worse with talks?
No. The civil war's been going on for 30 years. Just we, the British Army, will be stopping fighting it. It will be fought by Afghans, far more. I simply don't see what alternative is offered. But the nuances of what Lucy is saying have to be taken on board, because that's the reality. People pulling the strings here are not British diplomats. We don't have a dog in this fight. Nobody trusts us, and we have no influence anyway. It's the US and Pakistan. They're the players here, with auxiliaries in the Afghan state government. By the way, just one small point, John, you mentioned, I thought somebody mentioned the Ministry of Vice and Virtue. I understand what the Taliban are looking for as well is the Ministry of Mines.
Mines?
Yeah, mines.
Resources?
As in resources, yeah.
And John, did you answer this question, how could it be worse? You're just saying it can't be worse. Is that basically it? Sorry, Frank, did you say, how could it be worse? How could talks be worse than the current situation, than just leaving, is the question?
Well, the current situation is the default worst option, and therefore talking can only make things or bring things to a close, and that can only be a positive thing. And it's very simplistic. I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do.
I mean, for many years, the Afghan government and the NATO alliance has been looking for a Taliban address. They didn't know where to find the Taliban, where their address is. So the office was open precisely for that reason. They wanted to find an address for the Taliban. And now they have that address. but certain things are not working. But when it comes to this question, the US and NATO tried for many years to defeat the Taliban on the battlefield. But now it seems that there's a mutually hurting stalemate. This is one point. The second point is that many Taliban also know that they cannot win by force, even after 2014, for two reasons. One is this is not a Soviet-style withdrawal of Afghanistan. This is not a total abandonment of Afghanistan. The US and the Afghan government are now discussing a bilateral security agreement, which will mean that maybe 10, 15, up to 20,000 American troops will still remain in Afghanistan in different locations after 2014. So it's not a Soviet-style abandonment of Afghanistan. So this will be the same stalemate, it seems, in the next few years. So talks can result at least in a ceasefire, or at least in some sort of confidence-building measure.
It's a long way around saying that they're not worse, but I mean it's a good briefing. I mean, there's a lot of your. I'm taking in a lot of your information, but I think the summary is it's not worse. Now, I've just heard that Morsi said he's no longer president of Egypt. News just coming in on the latest frontline message system, which we'll be talking about in 20 minutes. But let's focus on the last 12 years of war in Afghanistan, and as Frank was reminding us, 30 years if you want to be accurate, 40. Now, would you like to, we're going to move on to how negotiations could be conducted. If it's an Afghan lead, what should international people do? But a question from you, maybe introduce yourself.
It's very relevant to that, in fact. Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. Going back to the very basic question, should we talk to the Taliban? We've said, well, who are the Taliban? Who are we? I don't speak Pashto. I don't feel that I'm part of the we. And this is, I think, a very fundamental question. I've said in this room and many other places ever since 2001, 9/11 was a crime, not an act of war. It could and should have been dealt with under using international law. Taliban may be very unpleasant, but nevertheless, you have to negotiate with unpleasant people. And I also advocated at that time an international civil society deputation to talk to them. That, I think, is still a possibility. That is still a more constructive approach than anything that either the British or the US government can offer in terms of this. And, well, I think that's my basic point, that the civil society, incidentally, there are civil society initiatives going on in Afghanistan. I know people from the British peace movement who've gone and talked to people on the grassroots and got a very positive response from them. So I'm questioning the whole basis of the discussion so far, asking for something much more radical, aimed at focusing on human rights, yes, but from a grassroots point of view, not from a superior Western, we're better than you. And the other thing, how about a peacekeeping force primarily based on Muslims?
Okay, well, let's take this in turn and move on to ask, how the negotiation should be conducted. Who are we? Should they be Afghan-led? And what about the international role? But just to take Frank's points, Lucy, who are we when viewed from the other side? Frank's point there is it's quite shaking me. I mean, who do we appear to be? What's our agenda from the other side?
First of all, I just want to respond to Dawood's
Do you mind not doing it first?
Very quickly, okay. We do have an address for the Taliban. We do have an address for them. It's in Rawalpindi. Bin Laden was found in a butter bag. End of story. Yes, we are players in this. We're not just benign observers on the outside. The US has given something like $6 billion of unearmarked, unconditional aid to Pakistan since the capture of bin Laden. We need to start conditioning or encouraging the Americans and we ourselves to condition that aid that the Pakistan military stops its support for these proxies in the Afghan war.
So, and Frank's question is, who do we appear to be? Is it an interesting question to you? Can you answer it?
Well, I think that we're sort of benign fools on the outside, basically, in these negotiations.
John D. and Frank and everyone?
Well, I would say...
Useful fools.
I would say we look like people who are trying to get out and will talk to pretty much anyone who offers a way of getting out and saving face. I'm not entirely convinced that the Americans are totally committed to solving this. I think they want to look like they're solving it, and they just want to get out, and if it's all a mess afterwards, it's someone else's mess. And that's why Karzai threw all of his toys out of his pram last week and, you know, kicked off over the flag, and which in fact has made him far more popular.
Frank, how do we look? Have you considered that question? Do you have an answer for it?
We the British are seen as rapacious serial invaders who are distrusted, and as we've seen throughout most of the Muslim world, sort of east of Jerusalem.
Dawood?
Well, I think there are four main parties in this process: Taliban, US, NATO led by US, the Afghan government, and Pakistan. So the talks are as much as between Afghanistan and Pakistan as they are between the Afghan government and the Taliban.
And do we appear to be
Pakistan's cooperation is critical.
Okay,
and there are spoilers on both sides.
I will ask you to kick off in just a second.
Yeah.
I'll ask you to do how they could be conducted. But to answer Frank's question, how did the Western lot appear? Do they appear to have the same? Are they the same? Do they divide us into British and Americans?
No, I think it's the US. They want to talk to the US.
So we're either bad or irrelevant, depending on your view.
They're in the same camp
It's not great,
for the
is it?
Taliban. So just one more.
No,
point.
not now. I'm going to lead, you can lead off. We're going to the audience. It has to be short because we're at the end.
So the Afghan government.
I'm coming to you.
The Afghan government has been insisting that talks should be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned.
I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Right. To you at the back, then you at the front.
Okay, Najibullah Razak, three very quick points. First one about ISI, Taliban being Rawalpindi, it's just BS. There's no truth in that. Taliban are never controlled by Pakistan or ISI, although they have influence over Taliban. There's a big difference between having influence or control. And, I'm a regular visitor to Rawalpindi, Islamabad, all over Pakistan, haven't seen an office there. I met Taliban, and where I met them in shops, in madrasas, in houses. Okay. Nowhere in an office. Second point is about Qatar office. Qatar office, the question is, are we talking Taliban or do we want to talk Taliban? The question should be, are the Taliban talking to NATO or to us? Taliban are not talking to Karzai government. Taliban are not talking to Americans. The idea of Qatar office is to do the prisoner exchange.
Okay.
And they will be asking for 6 prisoners, not 5. Right. And those people in Qatar, they are with a list of demands regarding prisoner swap. Right. They have no influence.
I feel you're making a sort of general on our whole evening, and I have to bring it in structure. So do you have a contribution to make? It's very interesting listening to you summarise our whole evening, but do you have a contribution to make on how these negotiations should be conducted?
There will be no negotiation, I can promise you this.
There will be no negotiation.
The reason the Qatar office is, it's to do with prisoner exchange, and that's it. Taliban are not making Afghanistan as a second Palestine.
So this is not a serious talk from their position.
You can take my words on it, and you can bet on it. And the last comment is...
But I don't really want another one, I'm sorry.
Sure, no, I have to say, this is a lot. The Russian told the communist regime, the communist government of Afghanistan, Dr. Najibullah, that Afghanistan is either ours or the people who are in the mountain. And I think it will be soon the American will realize this, that NATO will say it's either Afghanistan is, they will tell Karzai Afghanistan is either ours or the people who are fighting in the mountains, which are the Taliban. Thank you.
No, well, thank you. I know the passions are high here. It's just I have to try and ask you to be in subjects.
Very simple. We haven't said United Nations.
Irrelevant.
Irrelevant to our friend. You can keep the microphone. Why would you say it's irrelevant?
I think the UN lost all credibility back in 2001-2 when they made this Faustian bargain with the warlords, and of course in collusion with the United States, which was to bring back all these war criminals into the government.
Do any of you disagree before I move on? With that position on why is the UN irrelevant?
The UN Under Secretary General yesterday said that if we are asked, we will help in the peace process. This was yesterday, but it hasn't been part of it. But the UN is involved when it comes to delisting, because a lot of Taliban leaders are on the UN blacklist. So the UN has removed some of them, and some of them are still on that list. So UN will be involved in this process at some stage. But when it comes to the Afghan government position, they say that we want to be in the lead.
Right.
But many Afghan officials say that we don't own this process and we are not leading this process.
Let's go there now with everyone. Let's go to that question now.
They say that we want to be in the driver's seat, and now they are not even in the car.
Okay. Right. So we'll go to this question of who leads the negotiations. Frank, you were strongly in favour of them, and I'm going to come back to you. Frank, who should lead? How would it work? If you could sketch us one, it may not be the only one, but give us a likely how talks could be conducted.
Could or should?
Well, you can pick. It's getting near the end,
Yeah, right.
so it's whatever you most want to put it as.
Right. The most successful, at least so far, peace negotiations, peace conference took place in the last 20 years was at Dayton. That's where you involve all parties, all surrounding countries, and all interested nations, without preconditions, and you talk to whoever will talk back. That means Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Russia, the United States, and have what Sherrod Cooper-Coles has been advocating for many years, and have a comprehensive peace deal. That's what should happen.
And where could that be based, and who would be in the chair?
I hesitate to mention the UN again, since they've been so battered over the last 5 minutes, but it should take place in a neutral country, as the Dayton Accords did. In fact, at the time, the US was fairly neutral on these matters and was seen as an honest broker.
Is Qatar a neutral country? No. So we have an office in Qatar, but it can't happen there.
Johannesburg, Pretoria, some are far away where there can be a comprehensive agreement on the lines of Dayton. That's what should happen. It's not what's going to happen, but that's what should happen.
Lucy, you're nodding that that's what should happen. What's likely to happen, do you think?
I mean, to be very cynical, I think that what the United States wants is this sort of veneer of stability so that it can just get out. And unfortunately, if it gets out, everything's going to collapse. And that's not just going to be civil war, but again, this influence coming from the southeast. And I'm sorry, I do disagree with the gentleman at the back. I think if you read a lot of the literature from the 1980s, the time of the Geneva Accords, by ex-UN peace dealers and American ambassadors and so on, you see the sabotaging of so much by Pakistan, which is desperate to keep Afghanistan as a client state.
And to you, John D., will Pakistan be involved? If they're not, does it have any meaning?
If they're not, it doesn't have any meaning. But I'm not sure whether they will be openly involved. There are players in the shadows who are major players, and we all know it, but it's not being acknowledged because it's a problem that makes the whole idea of talks more complicated. And I agree. I said it already. I'm not entirely convinced that the Americans actually are committed to making these talks work, because if they were, it has to be the comprehensive package. That's the only way it works. You get everybody in, and I'm dubious about some of the people who say that they want to talk, but there are lots of, give everybody a chance to come in, and then you will find the people who are moderate, or maybe not moderate, but absolutely exhausted, fed up, or who have just figured out it can't continue. But if Pakistan are not involved, it won't work.
And who would lead them? Who would chair them, in your view? Or who should and who will? Who will?
Not Brahimi.
Well, I won't say who will, because I don't think it's going to happen.
No, it's a difficult question. Right. And to you, I promised I'd come back to you. What role for the international people?
I think location is not important. The main question is about sincerity. Are they sincere? Do they really want political settlement? Or neighboring countries helping the Afghans to stabilize their country, or they are using it as a battlefield? So, the Afghan conflict has 3 dimensions. One is internal. There are different groups with different agendas. Then it's regional at another level. It's Pakistan, Iran, Pakistan's rivalry with India. Then it goes up to China and Russia. And then at international level, it's Al-Qaeda, it's the US, it's NATO. So
does that answer how negotiations should be conducted?
So I think all of them should be involved because they are players in this conflict.
So can I ask you all then from the panel to give us your closing thoughts, the things that weren't said, the things that surprised you, the way you were misinterpreted or the thing you were cut off from saying, and then we'll bring things to a close. Going in reverse order, John D., would you like to make a brief close?
Yeah, I would. I want to come back actually to somebody who's a lot smarter than me talking about Afghanistan, Michael Semple, who was talking the other day, and he talked about, we're talking about why
he did talk to the Taliban, didn't he?
Yes, he did, extensively. And
was thrown out for doing so.
Yes,
But he also
absolutely.
works for MI6.
Well, he made a point.
We don't all know that. I don't
Well, we do. I used to work.
I think as a chairperson, I have to say that's a disputed fact.
They're paying a salary at Harvard.
He made a point very simple. Why, and it was discussed earlier, why would the Taliban want to talk? And he made a point very eloquently that the Taliban's war is approaching its sell-by date. A lot of the young men that they have recruited to fight has been on the basis they are fighting the foreign invader, the infidel, and the Americans and the British and everyone else, but the infidels are leaving in 2014, and it's going to be a lot harder for the Taliban to recruit people to fight. And so it has to be acknowledged that they also have a motivation to engage in talks.
Thank you very much. And you've been spending a lot of your time there. You were shot there. I mean, a question was asked by Frank, who are we? Can you tell us why you're motivated as a Westerner?
Well, I mean, who are we? I mean, I'm an Irish guy, so I know I'm.
That's still in the West currently.
Yeah, I know, and we have 7 soldiers in Afghanistan, and I've been unable to find them. I believe they may be running the bar in.
Can you explain why? What is it about this conflict that, as a journalist, what is it? Why is this your war?
God, that's not a short answer. I didn't know it was going to be. I went out there in 2006, but the British were just about to deploy. You know, the MOD had put all sorts of rules on what you couldn't do, so I was like, well, fuck that. And I went out to the Canadians, and then I managed to, and they were just deploying, and then I managed to sneak into Helmand and do all sorts of things that I wasn't supposed to do. And what I saw going on out there was pretty awful. And then I came back and saw that, and you know, nobody could really get access. It was just impossible at the time. And the reporting here was atrocious. Nobody had any idea what was going on. And the Canadians, the same thing. I mean, I was threatened. I was threatened with a lot of things by Canadian lawyers at one stage. I photographed an event that happened. And basically, the soldiers that I was with let me photograph everything. And they said, there's no way you'll ever get clearance to put this out. And I was holding in front of some lawyers who threatened me with all sorts of things that I breached the Geneva Convention. But the fact is, the young Canadian soldier said to me, the people at home are being told this is a peacekeeping mission. Well, I'm getting fucking shot at a lot, and it doesn't feel like a peacekeeping mission.
So Frank, you're nodding a bit. An existential war, you described it as, ignored by the population who are going shopping, and you've made criticism of the BBC, but basically, can you summarise your view of the evening and add something that you didn't...
The only thing which hasn't come up is British national interests, our own interests, why we had our soldiers there. It's time for us to withdraw graciously and as quickly as we possibly can and draw a line under these quasi-imperial adventures. And there's a lesson to be drawn. You know, we'll go on to those perhaps in the next minute or two. Lots of lessons, and they've got to be listened to about what we can do now and what the difference between what we can do and what we should do.
Take a minute to give us the answer to that question, because there isn't a lot more time actually. What is the lesson?
Well, it would be interesting to hear if there's anybody advocating arming the Egyptian rebels as there are the Syrian rebels. Rory Stewart said, he's quite right, there's a difference between what we should do, what there may be a moral imperative or an apparent moral imperative to do, and what we can do. And in discussing and in considering that question, it's vital to understand what are our national interests and what are the objectives, and whether or not there are political, to come right back to the start, whether there's a political track in place, and there isn't in Syria at the moment, or, well, I don't know, Egypt seems to be changing by the minute. This, and back to the topic at hand, this should be our last imperial adventure, and we should look back on it with pride in our soldiers, but with shame with the way it was conducted. That's all.
Lucy, you know, we all came in is talking the Taliban a solution. Is there anything you weren't heard on, or do you have a conclusion to add?
I think I heard recently, I live in Geneva, where there's a lot of the humanitarian community, that Afghanistan now has the biggest caseload of refugees in the world. I mean, that's apart from Syria, which is an acute thing right now. But generally, in the last couple of years, Afghanistan is now the biggest caseload of refugees. I think, just to add, this is all way more complicated than we can get into tonight. But I think it's really incumbent upon us to try to understand the history of this, try to understand where we went wrong, to read as much as we can, because, you know, it looks like we are going to be getting involved in other adventures. And I personally don't think that security sector reform, for example, building up national security forces in Mali or in Syria, is the way ahead. You have to understand the localized regional and political problems and economic problems on the ground.
Dawood, as the member of the panel who does speak Pashtun, what surprised you about the evening? You've been working in the UK for 13 years, I think you said. Did you see a new side to the British tonight, or did you see anything new or hear anything new?
No, I mean, they're pretty much the same views that we've been hearing for the past 12 years.
Sorry, Lon. Sorry. You're going to have to pay double if you want to get out.
But a stable and peaceful Afghanistan means a peaceful world. Afghanistan is a country, part of this world. If it is peaceful and stable, it means that region will be peaceful, Britain will be peaceful, and the rest of the world will be peaceful. So, and Afghanistan has been a battlefield for other countries' adventures. So when two empires in the past wanted to fight each other, they chose Afghanistan. The Russian Empire and the British Empire chose Afghanistan, and then Soviet Union and the Western Bloc chose Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda and now NATO, they again chose Afghanistan. And Pakistan, India chose Afghanistan to fight each other.
And Kashmir, they like doing it there as well.
Well, Kashmir is now quiet. It has moved to Afghanistan. And Iran and Pakistan chose Afghanistan to settle scores with each other. So it has been very unfortunate situation for the people of Afghanistan. So they deserve peace now, and the rest of the world should help them.
Well, I mean, I disagree with you. We've been listening to these arguments for 12 years, and I think we have learned something new tonight from you, if I may say, and also to you in the audience. Thank you for keeping your contributions, you know, as much as we can, themed. But we were listening very closely to you all. Frank Ledwidge, former Naval Reserve Military Intelligence Officer. Lucy Morgan-Edwards, author of The Afghan Solution. Also Dawood Azami, BBC World Service. And John D. McHugh, whose film is Drawdown. Maybe it should be shown at the Frontline Club, and you can come and author it for us on another night.
Shown on the BBC.
Or shown on the BBC. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you to you as well. Just to say, what I propose is please leave, and then in 5 minutes, people in the room can pick a news channel, read out what's been said.
I just want to give you an Egypt update.
No, well, people must leave. You can give your update in 5 minutes, to be fair.
There's been a coup. It's over.
There's been a coup, it's over, he's gone. Okay? But if you want a bit more information, stay 5 minutes. BBC on live, right? So you can do it in 5 minutes. If people go, otherwise we're going to do Egypt in 5.
The military took over Egypt. Yeah, but what's happening? Well, they're going to have, in 5 minutes' time, they're going to have an Egypt thing.
Oh, are they? All right, so that's Thank you very much.
Doing Egypt with another panel?
No, we're just going to brief, we're just going to swap information. Just going to swap information.
Hello, Frank. All right.
Okay.
Thanks for getting national interest in there. I had my, I was trying,